Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, bringing you discussions concerning fair cattle markets. Today we have the opportunity to chat with Carson Jorgensen. He is a sheep rancher out in Utah, and also Austin Snedden. He is a cattle rancher out in Central California. So I've had the opportunity to interview both of you, but in case some of our followers don't know who you guys are, will you tell me a little bit about your background and your involvement within agriculture?
Sure. Austin, I think you're up first.
Go ahead, Carson.
So, like I say, my name's Carson Jorgensen from here in central Utah. We've been ranching sheep here in Utah for the last couple hundred years. Like I say, my family's been heavily involved in the commercial sheep industry. We were very much involved in what went on with Mountain States Rosen and the closing there and the investigation from the Department of Justice into JBS and the acquisition of that plant. And so, like I say, I think this is a topic that has to continue, and we have to keep talking about these things.
Austin, do you want to give me a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. My family's been cattle ranching here in Kern County for since 1868, so for over 150 years. And we make all of our income off of cows, and we have a BLM lease, we have a Forest Service lease, we have deeded ground. We also have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife lease. So in terms of federal land policy, we've kind of been very attuned to all those things. And then also on the market side, my family's been involved for a long time on trying to get some more competitive markets on the cattle side and to return some leverage back to the producers.
Fantastic. Carson, I'm going to start with you really quick. You mentioned the Mountain States Rosen plant. There wasn't any true articles that came out after everything went down. There was all this hubbub about it, and then it was just kind of silent. What happened with that situation?
I think what happened there was when things with the Department of Justice gets involved, once it hits the Department of Justice, it seems like it hits a gridlock pretty quickly. It's kind of unfortunate, but once it enters into the Department of Justice, even Mike Lee's office really didn't know what was going on at that point, and everything kind of went silent. As far as I know today, JBS has taken over that plant. They've retrofitted it for their new beef cut up facility for their other plant, their kill plant across the road. Like I say, we have now opened a family that was in on that deal has now opened the plant in San Angelo, which will be a really good thing for the sheep industry to open that market back up in Texas, but not just that, but to have more markets to be able to get the lambs to market. Like I say, it's going to be a good thing for the industry, and it was really good timing on their part.
Austin, you mentioned that your family operates on a fair amount of federal land. How do you see the Biden administration affecting your federal land?
There's no doubt that Democrat administrations have been worse than Republican administrations in terms of land use for cattle and just land use for essentially anything productive or recreational for that matter. So I have no doubt that they're going to expand on what they would call conservation, which would be more restrictions, looking to add more wilderness areas and things like that, which all end up being restrictions on cattle producers and other industries as well as recreation.
Right. Carson, in Utah, do you operate on any federal land?
Yeah, most of our operations are on public land. We have a lot of forest leases, a lot of BLM leases for the winter. I think we have 10 permits probably in total. And so I agree with Austin. I think that Democratic administrations are sometimes hard to deal with. It's more on the conservation side, really push the wild horse deal, which is always a touchy subject no matter which way you look at it. There seems to be a lot of hoops to jump through, and the things that they have began to promise and the things that they're really talking about are really scary and kind of dangerous on the grazing end of things and on the extraction side of things. And so, like I say, who knows? We have to be able to work with these administrations, and we have to be able to work with both sides But like I say, he's absolutely right when he says it does get a little bit difficult.
As we all know, 2020 has been a challenging year, to say the least. For both of you guys, what do you feel has been the biggest challenge for your operation this year? Carson, let's start with you.
The biggest challenge was early on negotiating the ups and downs in the market. I think everybody was pretty worried come first of this year, and the market's still really volatile. It hasn't settled down one bit. I mean, we have swung from one end of the spectrum to the other. You saw fat lambs early in the year, January, February, at that $1.60, $1.70 mark. COVID hit. Everything that was in the freezers kind of started backing up, and the price was down around 80 cents. Everybody thought it was going to stay there. The market really shifted. Imports really shut down for a while because there was no reason for them to bring them here. And then all of a sudden, the price is back up at $1.60 again. So, like I say, navigating the volatility in the market. And the other problem was at the time that the market lambs were being sold, the price was really down. And so everybody took a pretty good beating when they sold their lambs this fall. So that was a pretty tough thing for the sheep industry this year.
Austin, what do you feel the most challenging thing has been in 2020?
Well, I think that if hypothetically I'd never heard of COVID, or I didn't know about the packer consolidation and the margins they were making, I would say that it was pretty good, because our steers that we sold in the spring sold right in the heart of COVID, sold not that far behind last year. And this is with all the COVID scares. So this just shows me that what we saw last year and what we saw this year just really points to that packer consolidation. So during COVID, you saw the retail beef not drop off at all, and in a lot of cases went up, and demand was up. And what we have the benefit in the beef industry, whereas as Carson in the sheep industry, they suffered more because lamb is such a restaurant dish that so many people eat their lamb in restaurants. Hypothetically, if I didn't know about COVID, I would say it was a little bit below average year, but there was the volatility like Carson's talking about. So we had, in the spring, we had our cattle to sell on a video. That COVID deal spiked the first time, and we ended up rolling them to another video, and then no selling them, and then we ended up selling them off the ranch, and we did pretty dang good, but for the market. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of those deals where we got stuck in it, and then we had people pounding at the door essentially looking for beef. They'd go out there and cut a side off of a steer if I'd let them, just thinking they go into that panic mentality and they want to fill their freezer. And we haven't really been set up to do anything but conventional beef production. But boy, it just really made you realize that all of the signals are there with the packer margins and people pounding at my door, that, man, the signals are there for entry into the packing market. There's just some obstacles that we need to cross to get those investors to get in that market.
Right. You referred to COVID-19. Our country is now seeing a second wave of the virus, and it is coming on strong. And we are starting to see consumers panic buy, and we're also starting to see shutdowns across the country. How do you feel this second round of chaos essentially is going to impact both of your industries?
I wish we knew. I really do. Like I say, the demand for lamb is really up right now coming into the Christmas season. The demand for lamb is usually high because around Thanksgiving through Christmas is really a high time of the year for lamb and beef as well. I mean, when you talk about the prime cuts, everything really comes to market this time of year. It's the best time to really sell other than Easter for the lamb market. And so I really don't know what this is going to bring. With the supply down, it really, to me, depends on what the imports do. Because if the imports come rolling back in here, it's going to be really hard on the industry because the price has already fluctuated twice in the year. We don't really need another one. And so I think that's going to be a really big part of it. The other thing is we just don't know what people are going to panic buy. During like Austin was saying, during the first wave of this deal, everybody was buying just about everything that they could find. And when beef and pork came scarce, lamb was still on the shelves. And so it really helped the lamb market to be able to sell a bunch of lamb because everything else was unavailable. So as far as this second wave, I'm not 100% sure. I wish I knew what was going to happen.
Yeah, I think we all feel that way. Austin, what do you think?
Well, I think, really blessed to be in an industry where people want to buy what we're producing. The one volatile side is that the consolidation, these plants are giant cities, and that COVID can rip through a plant and shut them down. And so these plants are so big and there's so few of them that if that's the case, then the live cattle just start backing up, and that's what really affects the markets in COVID, because people want to eat it, no doubt about it, and they're ready to buy it. But boy, if that rail speed slows down and it backs up, that's what really hurts us out on the ranch.
Austin, we've seen our markets gain some significant ground over the past few weeks. And I know this may be speculation. However, going forward, what do you see the cattle market doing heading into 2021? Do you think we're going to continue to gain some traction and get stronger?
I don't see much change, to be honest with you. I see that the futures for early in the near year next year are fairly decent, considering the year we're in. But I think that with the USDA's relationship with the big four packers and the NCBA using our checkoff money to kind of insulate the USDA and keep that situation how it is, I think that they're going to do everything they can to keep trade policy how it is, because it's working so good for them to satisfy their lean with foreign beef. They can keep trade policy the way it is. And then, like every producer, I sell slaughter cows and slaughter bulls, and I'd be happy for them to compete for my product. But really, if they can import it, they're not going to pay extra for mine. And so that lean market does trickle into the fat market. So I don't think that there's going to be a significant change up or down in the year to come.
You mentioned the checkoff. Carson, does the sheep industry have a checkoff comparable to what the beef industry has?
Yeah, there is, and it's really about the same thing. The pockets aren't quite as deep because we don't kill as many lambs as we used to. There's not as much poundage ran through the plants as there used to be. But as far as I'm aware, last I checked, it was like 0.007 cents per pound. And so, like I say, it adds up over the year. I mean, you start to figure how many lambs. I mean, they're going to run through 4 or 5 million lambs a year. It adds up, and it's kind of the same deal. And I think Mike Lee said it the best one time about the checkoff, or his office. Somebody in his office told me, it's like you guys are paying to get punched in the face. And I've always thought of that, and I've always thought that it was really interesting that's exactly what happens, is they take our money and they sit and fight back against the producers with our own money. And it should be a voluntary deal. And I'm a firm believer in that. If people want to pay, they should pay. They should never have to pay. And it's, to me, it's no different than taxation without representation. That's how this whole entire country started. And to me, it's exactly the same thing.
We're seeing the drought spread through much of our country. Is the drought affecting your operations, and how do you see, if the drought continues, how do you see that affecting your operation within the next year?
So the drought in Utah, it's been pretty bad this year. It really has. There's areas that have burned this year that we never thought you'd see burn. Like I say, it was pretty poor there for a while. I think we went 150 some odd days, 160 days without measurable rainfall. And then we had measurable rainfall, but it wasn't, but a tenth of an inch. And the desert is what really suffered. Our winter range is what really has taken a beating. And so right now we're trying to feed as long as we can out in the hay fields and the alfalfa before we send our 5,000 or 4,000 head to the desert, because we don't want to send them out that early, because like I say, the range is pretty poor and you want to give it as good a chance as you can to make it as long as you can before you put the sheep out.
Austin, what about you?
Well, California's kind of gone through a moderate drought, I would say, this year. Our operation's been really blessed and had decent rain when we needed. So we're here in Central California and Southern California. We're kind of an odd duck where we don't expect or want any rain from, let's say, May to October. So we're starting out dry. But so when May's here and we've got as much rain as we got, our cows are going to be eating the standing grass. So a dry summer is a dry summer for us, and it's actually better because that standing grass holds up better than it getting rained on. So we've had a good year. I for some reason, and maybe I'm just a born pessimist, but I have little confidence about the moisture we're expecting this winter. But I'm hopeful, and we're a kind of a naturally drought country, so you're expecting drought more than you're expecting rain, and we've just kind of lived to deal with it and adjust numbers up and down. And I think in terms of the market, boy, I think you're going to see, we don't really need a glut of cattle needing to go on the rail, especially if you have a plant shut down or not. And so a drought sure makes a lot less versatility in terms of timing when your cattle can go. And that's going to be a challenge for the folks that are needing to market their cattle because they're out of feed.
Through the years, and especially since this pandemic has hit, we have seen a lot of new plant-based meat products come onto the market, whether it be in fast food restaurants or in grocery stores. What are your guys' thoughts on this, Carson?
I'm not a huge fan. I'm not a vegetable guy anyways, but I'm not a huge fan of the plant-based stuff. And I think the biggest thing for me is the fact, they want to talk about science, you want to talk about all of this, but you start to look at the ingredients in those plant-based meats and all the processing that they go through. You can't tell me that's a good thing. You can't tell me that is in any way natural, and you can't tell me that that's in any way good for your body. And so when it comes to that end of it, I see no benefit in it. I truly don't see a benefit to the fact that these plant-based things, for that exact fact. I am sure that over the next 10 years, you're going to start to see effects on people's bodies that they had no idea was going to happen.
Yeah, it's quite the deal. What do you think, Austin?
Well, I've been naive in the past, but in my opinion, I think it's got to be just a trend because, like Carson says, you can't beat a single ingredient product that tastes so dang good and provides you so much protein. And that single ingredient deal, there's a lot of value in that, and so, I think that it's going to fade out. And I think it's kind of going to be one of those deals like when I was a kid, we were all supposed to eat margarine because butter was going to just make you drop dead in a minute. And then, 10 years later, all right, well, maybe margarine's not that great for you. And so, there was a lot of interest pushing that. There was essentially a soybean checkoff, pushing the whole vegetable oil and vegetable oil products, and that crosses over into science, and so then things get pushed. But I think it's a trend, and I'm thinking that people are going to get tired of sinking their teeth into that stuff that kind of, from what I hear, kind of stinks when you're cooking it, and they're going to want to go back to some natural, truly plant-based product, which is animals that eat plants.
Earlier, we touched on how the Biden administration will affect federal land that you guys operate on. What other impacts do you think the Biden administration will have on agriculture? There's been a lot of talk around fossil fuels and then also climate issues. How do you think that's all going to play out, and how do you think that will affect our ag industry?
I think it's about to get crazy, and especially from the climate change. When I saw that he has chosen John Kerry to head up the climate change and the green development part of it, I'm a little nervous, and I'm a lot skeptical because I know what happened last time, and I know what they want to push for. And really, I was having this conversation with some folks the other day. If you want to talk about the actual science, when you want to talk about agriculture is the only industry that has net zero carbon emissions. And it is proven time and time again. If you want to talk about science, let's talk about science. If you want to have the climate change conversation, well, then let's have this conversation because we're on the right end of this. because everybody knows, and it has been proven time and time again, that agriculture and livestock actually sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, put it back in the ground. And so if they want to have this talk, let's have this talk, because grazing and livestock, especially sheep and cattle, have a dramatic effect on climate change in a good way. And that is something that I think is going to come up. And I think this is the story that we have to continue to tell over and over again, that livestock is good. I mean, Austin probably saw it firsthand out in California this year, the string of wildfires that just wouldn't end. And from what I've heard, some of those places that they've had these wildfires used to be some of the most pristine sheep grazing country in all of California. And yet we're wasting this by not grazing it. And they want to talk about, let's save the rainforest, because Brazil keeps cutting down the rainforest every single year. And they keep talking about, well, we're cutting down the rainforest for beef production. Well, then quit giving Brazil an incentive to cut down the rainforest. Quit giving them a bigger market share in our market to let them continue to cut down the rainforest. Bring it back to the U.S. Let us control it. Let us graze off these wildlands that are really not good for much other than grazing. Turn that into food and yet save our fire problem all at the same time.
Yes, so well said. Austin, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Carson's right on. I would think, the only problem I have with kind of defending the livestock industry in terms of climate change is that in so doing, I feel like I'm almost admitting that maybe man-made climate change is real. But everything so hypothetically, if man-made climate change is real, everything that Carson says is absolutely true. I mean, it's by all means, it's the most sustainable industry of all time, just based on history. That defines sustainability. We've been doing it for pretty much the same way for 200 plus years. And so the only hope that I think we have is that, if the Biden administration's in there were over 72 million people that voted for somebody else besides Joe Biden. And so whether this election's real or not, I personally think it's a scam, but there's 72 million people out there, more than's voted for anybody in ever in US history, that are going to be ready to get rid of their representatives at any time. And so I'm thinking that that's going to give us a little bit of leverage. So hopefully they're not quite as bold in their absolute extremist views.
Carson, the sheep industry has a mandatory tagging program, correct? The Scrapie program?
So the Scrapies program, anytime you sell at auction, I mean, when we send our old used to auction, anytime stuff has to cross state lines, for the most part, yeah, there is the mandatory Scrapie, especially if it crosses into Canada or Mexico, you have to have those Scrapies tags.
All right. As you know, RFID tags have been a hot topic in the cattle industry. This Scrapie program would be somewhat comparable. Is it an efficient tagging program? What is your thoughts on that?
I think there's pros and cons to everything. I mean, when you look at the Scrapies outbreaks, if we were to happen to have something happen with Scrapies, at least you could know where it was coming from. You could start to find those animals and keep them separate and make sure those things don't happen. But on the other end, you've got everybody knowing your business all the time, seeing where these sheep have come from, especially with the RFIDs and cattle. They're a little bit easier to track than sheep because they're in usually smaller herds. I mean, you're not 4,000 or 5,000, you're 400 or 500 for the most part. And I mean, that's not everybody. It's just a generalization. But then, I mean, they can continually track where these cattle have come from. And then it creates incentive for people to do things that usually isn't a good thing. And so I think, like I say, there are pros and cons to both of them, but like it gets to be a slippery slope.
Right. Austin, I know that you and I talked about this on our last interview, but will you elaborate on your thoughts on a mandatory RFID program, if that would get implemented within the cattle industry?
Yeah, I generally don't like much that's mandatory, but in terms of the individual ID, I think it's kind of ironic that USDA is pushing for it. And, there's a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's a couple big tag companies that, of course, like the idea of it. But it's kind of ironic that USDA is pushing for it when at the same time they're pretty much open the doors to imports. So it's kind of like, well, if you think you need to know where every animal comes from on every single ranch in the U.S., but oppose country of origin labeling, to me, it's a non-starter. So if you want, you got to tell us first what country it's from before we even talk about tagging everyone in my herd, because you're starting from the wrong spot if the country doesn't matter, but the individual ranch in the U.S. matters. You're starting from the wrong spot.
Right.
And I think that goes without saying. I mean, when you want to talk about, I mean, that conversation can go a lot farther, because with the livestock deal in the United States, it's just a constant double standard when it comes to imports. I mean, here in the United States, we're required to adhere to the USDA standards. I mean, you can't sell anything unless it's killed in a USDA grade facility. I mean, there are rules upon rules upon rules of what we can and can't do, especially when it comes to imports. But then who knows where these things are coming from? I mean, we're getting animals from South America. We're getting meat from Africa, for heck's sakes. Who knows how this is killed? Is there a USDA inspector on every floor in every one of those plants? I don't think so. And this is a continual double standard, and Austin's 100% correct. Like, if they want to talk about labeling our stuff and making sure our food is clean, well, let's start talking about imports and see how things match up.
We have seen an incredible spike in bankruptcies across agriculture, and we have seen a lot of small to mid-sized producers drop out of the game, again, all across agriculture. What are your guys' thoughts on vertical integration just creeping more and more into agriculture across the board?
It's getting, I'm not a big fan of big ag. My family, we run between 4,000 and 5,000 sheep, and some people would consider us big ag, but there's a lot of difference in that to me. There's big family farms and there's big ranches, but there's also vertically integrated corporate farms. And there's a big difference between those. And I think a lot of times those big corporate farms give the farmers and ranchers a really bad name. But the problem is, most of the time, most of those are owned by the packers. And so that creates, once again, another double standard that we're calling it one thing, but not another. And so vertical integration, I could say, once you start to put all the eggs in one basket, to me, that makes for a really dangerous combination. When you start to put all your things in one place, and the USDA regulations, in my opinion, have pushed us to this point. They have forced everything into funnels, into bottlenecks, because the ones who can afford it get bigger and the ones who can't afford it go out.
Austin, what are your thoughts on vertical integration?
Well, I think in our industry, we don't really have any excuse to not oppose it, because the chicken and pig farmers kind of led the way in showing us what it looks like to go that route. And it's like you say, there's a mass exodus of the small to mid-sized producers, and so we can produce more beef, but there's going to be less of us doing it. And that might mean my family's out of business, might mean Carson's family's out of business. But so I think we really have no excuse to kind of show some resistance to vertical integration. And really, we've already seen a loss of leverage in our industry that the live cattle producers have. Vertical integration just puts you further down that road where you might own your place and you might own this and that, but you're essentially going to become an employee of the end guy, which is the packer.
Yeah. Sounds like a terrible reality.
And I'd like Austin's opinion, and Mackenzie, I'd like your opinion too, because this is a conversation we've really been having, especially on vertical integration. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. When the other side, because I've really been thinking about the other side and the arguments coming from the other side and how we can address those, because I think we're going to be playing a lot of offense and defense over the next 4 years if we're not careful. But I think in our quest to create cheap food, we've created a lot of these vertically integrated farms, and that leads to the conditions that these people don't like. And so for me, it's really going to come down to consumers. They're going to have to choose what they want. Do they want vertically integrated farms, or do they want farms and ranches that raise them in really natural way that are good for the environment? And we have to be able to identify. So I don't know, that's just my opinion right now, is that, like I say, in our quest to keep the price of food down and to create cheap food here in the United States, where we spend less of our income per capita than anywhere else in the world on food, that we have created ourselves these systems that are, if you want to call them inhumane or unclean, or these factory farms, whatever they want to call them. But that seems to be the case, that it's this chasing this cheap food that's creating these situations.
Right. I agree. I think our industry has agriculture across the board, or food just across the board. We are all about efficiency and creating cheap food. But then on the other end, we hear the producers saying they want this clean product, humane, but they also still want it cheap. So I think there has to be some kind of middle ground there. And my worry is with the economy going forward. I mean, people have lost jobs. Things just are not looking like rainbows and unicorns. I think price point is going to become more important than, say, how that food was produced, in my opinion. Austin, what are your thoughts?
I think absolutely. I mean, being able to choose what food you buy is definitely a luxury of having the disposable income to do it. Otherwise, you're just looking to fill your belly with something that'll satisfy you. So, I think that we haven't seen it yet, but you might be right, because I'm still constantly surprised by the things that make people want to buy things, and it generally has something to do with making them not only being a good product to eat, but also making them feel good and knowing that it was produced correctly. You know what I mean? Or even if it wasn't produced correctly, somebody says it was produced correctly. So I think that we're, we might get to that point. It's, if we have an economy where, people are buying on price alone, we might have that. But I still think even there, you got to have a differentiation, because there's no doubt always going to be those people that want to buy the specific one that was maybe more to their liking.
Right. And to what you just said, I think more than ever, and I think it will stay the same going forward, consumers want to know where their food comes from across the board. I mean, you go into a grocery store and almost everything is labeled. So they're more aware and they're more conscious of what they're putting in their bodies, in my opinion. You guys talk about big ag. There has been a push recently. There's been some legislation brought forward to do away with CAFOs. What are your guys' thoughts on this? And if this would actually be put through, I believe they wanted, within the next 20 years, they wanted to do away with all CAFOs, if I remember that correctly. If they were actually able to implement this, how do you think this would affect ag, and how do you think we will feed all the people, not just here in our country, but all around the world? Because we have to have some big production of protein to keep everyone fed. Carson, what are your thoughts on this?
I think they're up in the night. That's just my opinion. I don't see any way that we're going to continue, even at the pace we're going right now. I'm skeptical to see the way that we're going to feed the rest of the country and even the world, like you say. And I always hear the argument, well, if we just switch to a plant-based diet and we didn't waste all this food feeding animals, that we could feed everybody indefinitely. And that's not really the case, because what people don't understand is producing these grains at mass production like we do to be able to feed them to animals also lets us make and export extra grains and things to other countries to help these other countries out, because that's what they live on. I mean, their staples of life are not meat. Sorry. They're on corn, they're on wheat. Those are the staples for their life, and that lets us produce it cheap. And so their arguments have holes in them. Right. And I really don't see a way. I mean, when you want to put a cap on how many people or how many animals one person can have, where's your food going to come from? Because every year we continue to lose more and more farmers and ranchers, but yet we're expected to feed more and more people, but yet we're not going to be able to increase our numbers. Therein lies the problem.
Right. Yeah. It's ridiculous. Austin, what are your thoughts on this topic?
I think Carson's exactly right. And there's a very there's a very ugly side to whether it's banning confined feeding operations or climate change agenda. There's a very ugly side in terms of what it would cost to humanity. And it's mostly going to affect the poor people globally more than it is, the more wealthy nations. And so like with climate change, it's just people are still going to heat their houses. It's just going to cost them more to do it. And that climate change legislation is going to no doubt end up in people freezing to death in countries, or confined feeding, like Carson's talking about. If we eliminate feedlots, you're going to have decreased grain production because cattle are going to be out, and so there's going to be less efficiency in meat production. So people in the U.S. aren't going to eat as much of it, and then where they're going to be switching to the grains and stuff that we export to other countries to feed them, and then there's going to be a shortage there. So there's really a really ugly humanitarian side to these just phony feel-good things that these liberals propose.
And I'm with Austin on that one. Like these kind of policies disproportionately, everybody says they're going to help the poor and help the needy and do their humanitarian stuff, but these type of policies disproportionately affect poorer people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think enough people realize that. On a happier note, Thanksgiving is in a couple of days, and I would like to know what each of you are most thankful for from this year, from 2020. Carson, I'll let you start.
I'm pretty thankful this year. The easy ones are family and being able to ranch and that kind of stuff. But I'm also really thankful for, I know it's been a tumultuous year politically. I myself ran for Congress this year, and it was kind of we didn't get where we wanted to be, but it ended up being a really good thing. And I'm very thankful for the political awareness that's really come about this year. And I think we're at an opportunity right now. And if there is a silver lining in COVID, I believe that it is that people may understand that our food supply is pretty vulnerable and that our supply chains are in an awful precarious position and that we have a chance right now to fix them. And so it's my hope, and I'm really thankful for that fact, and I hope that it continues.
Austin, what about you? What are you most thankful for this year?
Well, I no doubt it would have to just start with family and my four little ones that are, well, they're not that little now, but they can, and the fact they can go out and help me, and I can boss them around on a ranch, and they're running out in the open. And then, really, I'm blessed to live in a developed country where we really have the luxury of worrying about a disease as mild as COVID. You know what I mean? And I'm not belittling COVID and what it does, but really, you live in a pretty good place when you have the luxury of being scared of a cold, a bad cold, So, and that's something to be thankful for in a way, and it just brings it to your attention.
Right, and to what you just said, my dad and I had that conversation here in the past day that we talk about these hospitals being overrun by everyone being sick. You go to a third world country and they don't know what a hospital is. We take so much for granted here in this country, and we have all these first world problems. But if we would just slow down and look around us, not in our own little bubble, but look around the whole world and what everyone is really dealing with, I think it would really change our perspective and probably give us a little bit more sense of gratitude. But with that, do you guys have any other topics you want to touch on, or any other subjects you want to bring to the table?
Seeing as I've been first most of the time, I guess
I'm out of words. Carson's a better speaker.
I'm really never out of words, and that's kind of the problem. I always seem to have too much to say, but I just think like Austin and I have talked about, him and I have talked about this on the phone. You and Mackenzie, we've talked about this over and over again. I think it's time we start to speak about agriculture. I think it's time we start telling our side of the story. And we have to start being on offense. For all these years, we've been playing defense and we've been taking what's left off the plate. But I think that as agricultural folks and as truck driving folks and as blue collar workers, it's time we start putting ourselves where we belong. we're the ones who make this world go round. And when you look at every single day and you look at what your day brings you, 3 times a day, I know it's kind of cliche to say, but 3 times a day you depend on farmers and ranchers. We can deal without cell phones. We can deal without the internet and without social media. We can deal without cars for that matter, but we can't deal without food. And I think that's something that we need to continue to tell. We need to talk about our side of the climate change agenda, because that's something that's going to be a massive push here in the future. And I have no doubt about it. So just kind of my thought to all farmers and ranchers, like, this is really the beginning of our fight, and we have to get out of our comfort zone and start talking about these things and start telling our side of the story.
Right, most definitely. Austin, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Carson's absolutely right. And I think that just to add to it, I think being very cautious of who's speaking on our behalf, because I think that, a lot of the times us cattle and sheep folks are very trusting people, and we let people speak on our behalf that may not necessarily have our best interest in mind. And I think we just kind of need to really know the folks' intentions that we're letting speak on our behalf, and kick the ones out that aren't, because there's a lot of folks in there just looking to serve their own needs and not necessarily ours. So I think that Carson's right.